All right, so yeah, we always love getting your thoughts and suggestions for what we should dive into. And,
Yeah.
you really got us thinking with this one.
Oh, yeah.
This article you sent over, I mean, it really makes you question those solutions we hear all the time,
Mm.
for like the big global problems we're facing. Like, is it really getting to the root of it, or are we just kind of, scratching the surface?
Yeah. I
Eh,
think that's a really good way to frame it because the hot article's main point, I think, is that when you're dealing with those massive kind of interconnected problems, like
Right.
environmental breakdown or the inequalities that seem kind of baked into capitalism, a lot of the go-to solutions that get thrown around,
Mhm.
whether that's some new technology, a policy tweak, or even, individual choices we make about what we buy,
Yeah.
they're often what the article calls false solutions.
Okay.
So they might seem like progress or, maybe offer a little bit of temporary relief, but
Yeah.
they're not really getting at those underlying
They're
causes.
not addressing the root cause.
Ex
Okay, so it's like a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like a Band-Aid or maybe even a distraction
Right.
from the deeper issues.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics here, because one of the things that really jumped out at me in this article is how much it pushes back against this idea that future technology is going to swoop in and, kind of fix everything that we've messed up.
Yeah.
The article calls this what was it, the tech savior complex.
Right, right. The tech savior
And
complex.
it seems like, it's suggesting that a lot of people, particularly, those in positions of power or who benefit from the current system,
Yeah.
they really cling to this belief that innovation can solve everything
Yeah.
without, requiring any fundamental changes to the way things are structured.
Yeah, I think there's a real incentive there, isn't there?
Yeah.
To believe that we can kind of invent our way out of these problems
Right.
without actually having to, shift the economic or social foundations that are maybe creating the problems in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And the article uses a really interesting example to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah.
It talks about these ideas for massive air purifiers,
Mm-hmm.
as a way to combat pollution. What's the article's take on that sort of solution?
Well, it basically sees it as a form of avoidance. Like
Okay.
instead of addressing those underlying industrial processes and the way we consume things, that are actually creating the pollution,
Right.
the focus shifts to this kind of downstream solution,
Okay.
right? Like cleaning up the mess after it's already been made. And the article uses some pretty strong language to describe this approach, calls it painfully lazy.
Yeah.
Because it's really just trying to deal with the symptoms without actually, stopping the cause.
Right. So it's not really solving the problem. It's just kind of,
Yeah, just kicking the can down the road.
yeah.
And the other key point the article makes is that this approach is inherently unsustainable.
Okay.
The sheer scale of the environmental damage that we're doing is likely to outpace, whatever technological fixes we come up with.
Yeah. It's like trying to, empty out a bathtub with a teaspoon when the tap is still running.
Exactly. A perfect
Me.
analogy.
Yeah.
And it's not that technology has no role to play, but
Yeah.
the problem is that if we're solely relying on technology to clean up the mess that's created by the current system,
Mhm.
it just allows the drivers of that mess to continue unchecked.
Right. So it's almost like it gives us a false sense of security.
I think so, yeah.
Like, oh, we've got this technology, so we can keep on doing what we're doing.
Exactly. And that might be the most dangerous aspect of it.
Okay, so we've talked about technology.
Mm-hmm.
What about those more, established institutions and policies?
Mm-hmm.
Like government agencies, things like the EPA or the
Mm.
criminal justice system. What does the article have to say about their effectiveness in addressing these big issues?
Well, the article makes the point that even though these institutions might have been set up with good intentions,
Right.
they often end up operating within the constraints of the very system that created the problems they're supposed to be solving.
Okay, so even though they're trying to do good, they're kind of limited by the system they exist within.
Yeah, they're kind of trapped within that same framework.
Okay, so for example, with the EPA, you've got economic pressures, lobbying efforts,
Mhm.
the political realities of the day.
Exactly. And all of those things are part of that capitalist framework that the
Right.
EPA has to operate within.
Okay, I see what you mean.
And then you have this issue that institutions tend to be reactive,
In what way?
Well, they're constantly trying to play catch up with the negative consequences that are produced by the system.
Hmm.
Like you mentioned the criminal justice system.
Yep. Yeah.
The article argues that instead of focusing on the root causes of crime, like poverty and inequality,
Right.
the system is more geared towards responding to crime after it's already happened.
Okay, so it's like addressing the symptoms but not the underlying disease.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So even when we try to implement reforms, through policies or institutions,
Uh,
the article seemed to suggest that we're still stuck in the same system.
yeah, the argument is that even those reforms are shaped by the logic of the market system.
Okay.
They might tinker around the edges, but they don't fundamentally change those core mechanisms
Right.
that are driving inequality or environmental destruction.
So the system itself kind of limits what's possible, even in terms of how we try to fix it.
Exactly. And it's not just, tweaking existing institutions. The article also looks at some more recent attempts at, bigger systemic change.
Right.
And specifically, it focuses on cryptocurrency as an example.
Okay. Yeah, cryptocurrency, that's a big one. And it's interesting because, there's this whole narrative around crypto, particularly Bitcoin,
Hmm.
being this revolutionary alternative to traditional banking and finance.
Right. It's all about decentralization and empowering individuals.
Yeah, exactly. But this article seems to have a different perspective.
It does. It kind of pushes back against that popular narrative.
Okay, so what does it say?
Well, it acknowledges that idea of cryptocurrency as, a potential disruptor to those traditional systems, but then it presents this counterargument.
Okay.
And the counterargument is that despite its decentralized nature, crypto, especially Bitcoin, with its limited supply, could still lead to massive wealth concentration in the hands of a few.
So it wouldn't really solve that fundamental problem of inequality.
Right. And the article argues that the deflationary nature of Bitcoin and the fact that there's a fixed supply
Hmm.
could actually create those same cycles of boom and bust
Interesting.
that we see with traditional currencies.
So it might not be as different as people think.
Right. It might just be a different flavor of the same underlying problems.
Okay.
And the article even connects this enthusiasm around Bitcoin to those old debates about sound money.
Sound money.
Yeah, which is this idea often found in, libertarian economic circles
Okay.
that advocates for currencies that have a fixed supply, like tied to gold or some other asset.
Right.
The point the article is making is that simply changing the form of currency, even if it's decentralized like Bitcoin,
Hmm.
doesn't actually address those structural issues within capitalism,
Okay.
that lead to things like inequality and financial instability.
So it's not a silver bullet solution.
Exactly. And there's another really interesting point that the article makes about this.
What's that?
It's that all the focus and hype around cryptocurrency might actually be diverting energy and attention away from those broader, more fundamental efforts to actually change the system.
So it's like a distraction.
Yeah, it's like instead of, focusing on how to reform the system, we get caught up in this kind of speculative frenzy around the next big thing.
Right, right. It's almost like a shiny object syndrome.
Exactly. And that's a concern that the article raises, has this focus on crypto actually pulled people away from working towards those bigger systemic changes.
Fascinating. Okay, so then the article kind of shifts gears a little bit and
Mhm.
starts talking about inflation and why it seems like it's this persistent feature of our economies.
Right, right. It takes a more macro perspective.
Yeah, and I found this part really interesting because, it contrasts the simpler economic systems like the gold standard where you have a pretty fixed money supply
Mm-hmm.
with those super complex interconnected markets that we have today.
Yeah, it's a world of difference.
Right, and the article's main point here is that in these complex systems,
Mm.
inflation and what people often criticize as, printing money,
Uh-huh.
those aren't just policy choices. They're actually structural necessities because of how capitalism works.
Exactly. They're kind of baked into the system.
Okay, so can you break that down for me a little bit? Like,
Yeah.
why would wealth inequality, for example,
Yeah.
necessitate the introduction of more money into the system?
Sure. So the article uses this helpful thought experiment to illustrate the point.
Okay.
Imagine a small, isolated community, with a fixed amount of money in circulation.
Okay.
Now, if wealth starts to concentrate in the hands of just a few people, those with less money are going to have a harder time, participating in the economy.
Right, they won't be able to buy as much.
Exactly. And that can lead to a drop in overall demand,
Okay.
which could then cause the economy to stagnate.
I see.
So to prevent that kind of economic gridlock, more money needs to be introduced into the system to keep those transactions flowing and keep things moving.
So in those modern fiat systems, where the money supply isn't tied to some physical commodity like gold,
Right.
governments and central banks have the power to inject that liquidity or essentially, print money
Exactly.
to try to counterbalance those tendencies.
Yeah. And the article argues that this isn't necessarily a flaw in itself.
Okay.
It's more like a symptom of those underlying dynamics of wealth accumulation that happen within a market-based economy.
So it's not that they're doing it just because they can. It's because the system kind of requires it in a way.
Yeah, it's like a necessary response to those deeper structural forces.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it kind of ties into this whole idea of, ethical consumerism,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of us probably try to engage in. The idea that we can vote with our dollar.
Yeah. Yeah, vote with your wallet.
Exactly. And make a positive impact by choosing those more sustainable or ethically produced products.
Right, right. It makes you feel good.
Yeah, it feels like you're doing something good. But what does the article have to say about that approach?
Well, it acknowledges those good intentions.
Okay.
People choosing to ride their bike instead of driving or buying fair trade coffee.
Right.
Those things often come from a genuine desire to make a difference.
Yeah.
But the article argues that the impact of those individual actions is ultimately limited when it comes to creating real systemic change.
Limited in what way?
Well, for a few reasons. Firstly, the economic system itself has a huge influence on our values and what we consider ethical.
Yeah.
So we're kind of operating within a framework that's already shaped our thinking.
Right. It's not a level playing field.
Exactly. And then there's the reality that a lot of consumers face genuine financial constraints. It can be expensive to consistently choose those more ethical products.
Right. You might want to buy that organic, fair trade, whatever, but it's like twice the price.
Exactly. And for a lot of people, that's just not realistic.
Yeah.
And then you have the pressures that businesses face, in this competitive market.
Right. They're all trying to stay afloat.
Exactly. And the article makes this point that even a company that genuinely wants to be more ethical or sustainable,
Mm-hmm.
they risk getting undercut by competitors who are willing to cut corners, on labor standards or environmental protections.
Right. Because at the end of the day, businesses are driven by that need to maximize profits.
Exactly. And the article even suggests that if an ethical company's products become too expensive,
Mm-hmm.
they could lose market share and might even be forced to go back to those more exploitative practices just to survive.
Yeah, it's a really tough position to be in.
Yeah, it's like a catch-22.
Exactly.
So that brings us to what I think is one of the most thought-provoking points in the whole article.
Which is this idea that exploitation isn't just, a few bad apples in the system. It's actually kind of built into the very structure of market competition.
Right. It's kind of baked into the cake.
Yeah, and the article uses some pretty strong language to describe this, calling it a self-regulating tyranny.
Yeah, it's a powerful phrase.
It is, and it suggests that those abusive practices can become dominant simply because they provide a competitive edge.
And it's not always driven by, individual malice.
Right.
Although that can certainly play a role.
Yeah.
It's more about those systemic incentives that push businesses to minimize costs and maximize profits.
And, it even uses that recent example of the antitrust case with Kroger and Albertsons to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
Right, because it shows how even when regulators are concerned about those potential negative impacts of reduced competition, like lower wages for workers or higher prices for consumers, which are forms of exploitation,
Right.
those dynamics are already present within the system itself.
Yeah, they're kind of built into the DNA of how capitalism functions.
So it's not like this merger is creating something entirely new.
Exactly. It's more like it's exacerbating those pre-existing tendencies.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap things up here,
Yeah.
what would you say is the article's main takeaway,
Hmm.
for someone who's been listening to us talk about all this?
Well, I think the core message is that we really need to think critically about those solutions that are being presented to us for these massive global challenges. The article is really pushing us to recognize that a lot of those seemingly positive approaches, whether they involve exciting new technology or well-intentioned policies,
Mhm.
might only be addressing those surface-level symptoms of the problems. They
Right.
might be creating this illusion of progress
Right.
without ever actually getting to those root causes.
So it's challenging that tendency we have to look for the quick fix.
Yeah, no.
Right?
Or to believe that those incremental changes within the existing system are going to be enough.
And it really makes you question whether the systems we have in place are even capable of solving these problems.
Yeah, exactly. Like, at what point do we need to look beyond just tweaking things around the edges?
Right. And consider whether the fundamental structures themselves might need a more radical rethink.
That's the big question the article leaves us with. Are we willing to question those basic frameworks that we've built our entire society around?
And, it's not about having all the answers, but it's about being willing to ask those tough questions.
Exactly. And to be open to the possibility that those solutions that seem the most obvious or convenient might not actually be getting us where we need to go.
Right. It's about being willing to challenge those assumptions
Absolutely.
and to really grapple with the complexity of these issues.
Because there are no easy answers.
No easy answers, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a conversation that we need to be having.
Absolutely.
So thanks for bringing this article to our attention. It's really given us a lot to think about.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, keep those suggestions coming. We love diving deep into these important topics and exploring those different perspectives. And who knows, maybe it'll even spark some new ideas or solutions along the way.
That's the hope.
Always the hope.
Okay.
All right, until next time.
Take care.
See ya.